Martin Heidegger is a 20th century German philosopher. There are many people who would say he's the most important 20th century philosopher on the continent. He came into philosophy from theology, and his philosophy from beginning to end always has a kind of religious sensibility. He studied with Edmund Husserl, and the method of choice was phenomenology. But although he began in phenomenology, even within his first book, Heidegger quickly moved beyond it. And as we'll see, he rejects some of the most basic premises of Husserl's philosophy. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party. And although he left the party after only a year, he never really repudiated or repented for his involvement, nor did he ever regret the Nazi movement in general. But in perhaps his strongest statement, he said that it failed to live up to its original purpose. His most important book, the one that most people read, is one called Being and Time. It was published in 1927, and it has been branded a part of the existentialist movement. I think, in fact, it does deserve to be classified that way, but Heidegger himself rather vehemently rejected the label. The book itself is about human existence. Unlike his teacher Husserl, who was interested primarily in mathematics and necessary truth, Heidegger was interested rather in what it means to exist, and consequently the problems of human life. He called what he did ontology, or even fundamental ontology, and he took as the dominant question in philosophy what he called the question of being. Again, this had a kind of religious dimension, and at various points in his philosophy, he talks about a new God, or he talks about the need of a God to save us. In fact, throughout his philosophy, there's this kind of passivity that one notes, in which we are to be saved from something. But the main question, the question of being, is one that motivates Being in Time, although very quickly, as you'll see, he moves beyond it and saves that for a later work, never in fact completed. Because what he wants to do is to understand not just what other philosophers since the ancient times have understood as what makes the universe what it is, what is the basic substance or ingredient in the universe, or what distinguishes one thing from another. But rather he distinguishes rather sharply between what he calls the question of being on the one hand and the nature of beings or entities on the other. And he makes very clear that what he's interested in is the ground of being, or that which makes entities possible, that through which entities can appear to us as things in the world. He makes a distinction between ontic questions, questions having to do with particular things and their nature, and ontological questions, coming from an old Greek root, meaning questions about the nature of being as such. But before he can investigate the nature of being as such, he tells us, we first have to examine the being through whom the question of being comes into question. And that is a creature whom he calls Dasein. To be very simple, Dasein is each of us. One might say Dasein is human being, but this is something that Heidegger would reject, and I think for good reasons. Because there's a sense in which, as a phenomenologist, what he's trying to do is find our primordial experiences, although as you'll see, he would never use the word experience, to understand exactly how it is that we see and perceive the world. But if we say right from the start, as many 18th century philosophers, for example, did, that what we're investigating is human nature or human understanding, we've already begged a number of important questions. Most importantly, isn't it the case that other creatures, perhaps Martians, some higher animals, share the structure of our minds in such a way that they see the world pretty much as we do, and the phenomenological truths to be described apply to them as well? Or looking forward to a kind of multicultural perspective, one might ask the question, how do we know that other people in other cultures in fact share anything like our view? When I describe, in Husserl's terms, the structures of my own experience, Could it be that I'm really describing something that's peculiar to me or to my culture or to people who speak my language, which doesn't apply around the world at all? And in his later works, Heidegger becomes very keenly aware of the possibility of other ways of experiencing being, other ways of seeing the world. And he's very careful not to try and generalize his own particular perspective. The central thesis on a philosophical plane of Heidegger's being in time, and all of his work afterwards, is directed against one philosopher, or one philosophical view in particular. The philosopher is Descartes, and we might say that what Heidegger's philosophy is all about is a kind of anti-Cartesianism. I said a minute ago that Heidegger would never use a word like experience, nor would he use words like consciousness, or mind, or subjectivity. Because the idea is that the very idea of Descartes' philosophy, that the world is split into two substances, mind on the one hand, body on the other, and God is kind of a third substance, is something that makes philosophy impossible, and understanding ourselves impossible. Because when you think about mind and body, we seem to be very quickly stuck with the idea that we are, first of all, our minds. Descartes makes it pretty clear. I think, therefore I am. What am I? I'm a thinking thing. But there's a sense in which we're stuck in our minds, and there's a very real question, which plagued Descartes and virtually all the philosophers after him. How we get outside of our minds to know the world in itself. Skeptics like David Hume doubted that we could ever know that we know the world as it really is. Other people like Bishop Berkeley and Leibniz suggested that what we experience isn't so much the world as much as the ideas in our minds which God has put there. So we find ourselves caught inside of our consciousness, whereas everything that Heidegger wants to say is that that notion, that view, is simply absurd. In place of consciousness and subjectivity, he simply talks about Dasein. And being in time, throughout the book, is basically an analysis of Dasein. Thinking about Husserl in terms of the essential structures of experience, we might say that what Heidegger is after are the essential structures of Dasein. And those essential structures are going to be what make our experience, not his word, as it is. When he rejects Husserl's emphasis on consciousness and the ego, he is rejecting the Cartesian tradition. And he also rejects what Husserl defends as the phenomenological reduction, or the epoche. Nevertheless, he wants to hold on to the idea that Dasein has essential structures and that we can discover what these are. The first and most important is this. Whereas Descartes talks as if, and Husserl later writes as if, when we examine our immediate experience, what we find is consciousness, or what we find is the ego. What Heidegger wants to say is, when we examine our immediate experience, again, experience is not his term, what we discover immediately is something that can be simply summarized as being there. In other words, being in the world. And being in the world is not to be construed as being in a spatial relationship, as if here's the world and I'm in it, the way we might talk about a wad of paper being in the wastebasket. But rather, being in has to do with a certain kind of engagement, such as when I say, I'm in philosophy. It's not a spatial relationship, but rather what I mean is one defines me in terms of my involvement in philosophy. All in all, what Heidegger wants to say is that the distinction between anything like the mind, consciousness, subjectivity, and the external world, objectivity, is to miss the point and put oneself off in a hopeless trajectory. What he suggests is that being in the world is an absolutely unitary phenomenon. And the first fact about Dasein is it is being in the world. What this means is there can be no Dasein if there's not a world. Philosophers have often talked about consciousness or the soul as if it could exist independently of the body, in fact, independently of the whole world. Socrates, long ago, imagined himself as nothing but a pure soul, thinking philosophy. Christian philosophers, for centuries, of course, have argued that the soul is, in some sense, completely free of the body and can exist without it, or, one suggests, without the material world. What Heidegger says is, for Dasein to exist is for it to exist in the world. There is no Dasein without the world. Conversely, because we're now approaching things from a phenomenological position, one wants to say there is no world without Dasein. So one of the first of these existential structures is going to be simply the fact that Dasein is in the world as a unitary structure with the world. What this means is that as we pursue our phenomenology of Dasein, what we're going to be doing is clarifying being. But the word that Heidegger often uses here is that philosophy allows us to disclose what's already there, or sometimes he will put it in terms of being discloses itself. The idea is that it's not as if we perform some sort of inference, and it's not as if things simply present themselves to us full face, but rather, as we engage in the world, we find things. And what he is about is trying to explain what this means. There's a very fancy word which is often used to describe this disclosing, this describing the ways in which things appear, which necessarily involves the process of interpretation. The word is hermeneutics, and it itself becomes a major force in 20th century European philosophy. But what's important, the way Heidegger does it, is that when we are talking about Dasein, when we are describing Dasein, we have to get away from a certain theoretical attitude. And in particular, we have to get away from the idea that Dasein itself is primarily theoretical. To say it's ontological is to say it asks questions. And many of those questions are going to be the sorts of questions that give rise to theory. But theory itself is fairly ethereal. Theory itself is something which is not, as Heidegger would say, primordial. Our basic engagement in the world is not theoretical. It doesn't have to do with knowledge, but rather it has to do with engagement. And the second point about Dasein is that it is not only being in the world, it is being in the world in a certain kind of way. Namely, it is engaged in tasks. Consequently, where other philosophers talk as if our primary relationship to the world is to know it, what Heidegger wants to say is our primary relationship to the world is to be involved in it, to care about it. In fact, care becomes a central concept for Heidegger. That to understand who we are, what Dasein is, and how it fits into the world, is first of all to say that we care about things. This isn't to say that we care for other people or care about them. Heidegger himself would probably not strike us as a very caring person. Nor does care mean here necessarily worry and anxiety, although these concepts do fall into Heidegger's philosophy too. But caring means simply having purposes, having emotions, having moods, being attached to the world in an involved way. And talking about emotions and moods here, which Heidegger does at some length, shouldn't be construed on the idea of these are things that are in us, that they are psychological states or anything of the sort. Because along with eliminating talk about consciousness and experience, he also is going to eliminate a good deal of what is often called psychology. Rather, there's a sense in which moods are in the world. And the idea is that our moods, as he puts it in a very clever pun, tune us to the world. Wittgenstein says at one point, a depressed man lives in a depressed world. Well, Heidegger, I think, picks up very much the same thought when he talks about our moods orienting us, our moods sort of putting us in a state such that we can deal with the things that we deal with. So if one goes to the world with a mood of resignation as opposed to a mood of ambition, one, of course, sees the world in very different ways. But the underlying concept here is that our engagement in the world, our being in the world, is to be construed not in terms of philosophical thoughts or scientific knowledge, but first of all in terms of everyday tasks. Take, for example, housework. If you're making the bed, cleaning the floor, washing the dishes, there's a good chance that you are not thinking about what you're doing at all. You're just doing it. You've done it many times before. You know what has to be done. To talk about knowledge here would be very odd. Or, to put it in a different way, Knowing how is an essential part of doing housework. But knowing that, well, in a way, that's a kind of secondary concept. Heidegger's way of putting this is to say, the world appears to us, first of all, as equipment. And to say that the world is equipment is to say that when, for example, I pick up a mop to mop the floor, I do not see the mop as a thing. I do not study it. I don't take on what John Dewey, his contemporary, called the spectator view of knowledge. Rather, I use the mop, and I use the mop to do what I'm supposed to do, and in fact, I'd never really pay attention to it as a thing at all. Which changes the question. The question now becomes, how do we come to see things as things? Philosophers like Kant would argue that one of the basic categories of the mind is that we must see the world in terms of things, in terms of objects. What Heidegger tells us is that's not the way we primordially see the world at all. We use things. And let's take the mop as an example. When do I look at the mop? When do I look at it as an object? Well, the short answer is when it misfunctions. When suddenly something gets caught at the end. When the stick of the mop breaks. Or when I get a splinter from running my hand down the handle. At that point, I will hold it out and I will actually look at it as a mop. In general, the idea of seeing the world in terms of objects is derivative of the idea of being engaged in the world. And that's the primary concept. So when we talk about being in the world, we're not simply talking about the world of science. And in fact, Heidegger is very often hostile to the world of science. Rather, what we're talking about is a world in which we do things. And running through Heidegger's philosophy is a kind of almost obsession with a simpler life, a life in which people were simply involved in their tasks, involved with the earth in a very straightforward way. He is well known for his peasant hut in the Schwarzwald, in which he, quite frankly, enjoyed having a beer with the local neighbors as opposed to the many great philosophers who tried to visit him. There's a sense in which this basic engagement in the world, as opposed to the more cerebral and especially the more technological ways in which we deal with the world, is always on his mind. So the idea is that when we talk about being, what we're ultimately talking about is not some grand theoretical concept, so much as what we're talking about is something which is very immediate and practical. But that raises another kind of question. When I see the mop as a thing, part of what I see at that point is the mop as a distinctive object, distinct from all the other things, for example, in my kitchen. But insofar as the mop is a piece of equipment, Heidegger wants to say it is simply part of the totality of equipment. You can't separate the mop from the floor, from the soap suds. What's more, you can't simply separate me from the mop, from the totality of equipment. Because there's a sense in which, while I'm mopping, I'm not at all self-conscious of what I'm doing. I'm not thinking of myself at all, at least insofar as I'm mopping. And so there's a sense in which you might say the I here doesn't make an appearance. There's a sense in which I am simply engaged in the task. And insofar as there's any notion of self at all, it is simply the self as engaged in the task. This raises a whole host of questions further, because philosophers have often talked as if the self is something rather immediately knowable, as if the self, in one form or another, is part of every experience. When Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," what he suggests is that all you have to do is reflect for a second, and you realize that you exist. Heidegger asked the much more difficult question. What if that self that we ordinarily refer to isn't the true self at all? What if, in fact, it's some sort of bogus self, or not what he will call our authentic self? Then the question of the self becomes just as problematic as the notion of thinghood is in the earlier part of his philosophy. What Heidegger argues is that indeed, when we normally refer to ourselves and think of ourselves, we're not referring to our authentic selves at all. Now, we tend to think of authentic in its English translation as the word genuine, true self, and I even already used that locution. That certainly is involved in what Heidegger is doing, but a more accurate translation and a better conception of what he's got in mind has to do with being one's own self, as when we say of someone, he is his own man. It has a ring of individuality to it, and Heidegger defines it at one point as taking hold of oneself. One can see here the shadow of two of his favorite authors, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, both of whom were staunch individualists, Kierkegaard insisting that one must be a Christian in one's own terms, and not with any reference to other people and how they think of you. And Nietzsche, of course, has a long argument against what he calls slave morality, in which we find ourselves submerged in the herd and thinking in terms of our mutual protection, rather than in terms of our own personal excellence. There's a sense in which authenticity carries much of this baggage and is very much a kind of individualist notion. But as you'll see, it's not just that. It's contrasted, of course, with inauthenticity, where inauthenticity refers to something that is not our own self. Excuse me. It's what Heidegger refers to as the Das Man self. This is another coinage, like Dasein. It comes from the notion of man ist, meaning there is or one is. It's kind of an anonymous expression. It's really just grammatical. It doesn't refer to any proper noun. What Heidegger's doing here is considering ourselves as anonymous. The self that we usually refer to is, in an important sense, anonymous, and that's what makes it inauthentic. It is not our own self. What he has in mind is a kind of social construal of the self. When you think of how you describe yourself, for instance, you often describe yourself in America in terms of what it is you do. So you describe yourself in terms of your function, your job. In China, if you're asked, who are you? The answer will probably be, I'm a member of this family. I'm the third son, or the first son, or the second daughter. In both cases, what we do is we identify ourselves in terms of social constructs. And this is true even when we try to describe ourselves. We describe ourselves as intelligent, say. But of course, intelligence is a comparative notion. It is not something one is all by oneself. It rather compares us with other people. The Das Man self is inauthentic insofar as it is strictly a social self. It is not one's own self at all. In a further analysis of Dasein, Heidegger tells us that there are three essential existential modes, which, very briefly, are what he calls, first of all, existence, a term which he takes straight from Kierkegaard, where existence isn't something which simply means taking a place in the world, the way a pot might take a place in the world, but rather existence is a very special notion, and it's not something human beings exercise all the time. Existence has to do with possibilities and choices. This is to be contrasted with what Heidegger calls facticity, a term that Jean-Paul Sartre will borrow from him more famously later on. Facticity has to do with all those aspects of ourselves in which they're simply given. Or in a very dramatic phrase, Heidegger tells us, we are thrown into the world. We are born at a certain time, in a certain place, of certain parents, in a certain epoch, and we don't have a choice about any of this. And we come to appreciate the contingency of our lives. We imagine, for example, being born in the 13th century, or we imagine being born 10 years earlier or later. But there's a sense in which we can't really get into those positions, because the fact is that our Dasein is very much wedded to where we happen to be thrown in life. The third category is fallenness. The term harks back to the biblical story of the fall, and certainly Heidegger does have something in mind about it of that sort. Fallenness is falling back from our sense of authenticity to the inauthentic self, to falling back to a sense of being our own person, to simply being part of the crowd. It's very important to emphasize, though, that Heidegger doesn't present this in a critical way. Fallenness, simply being involved in tasks and involved with other people in tasks, is an essential part of our existence. We can't possibly escape it. We could not be authentic all the time. But the idea is that fallenness is to provide a contrast with existence and seeing our own possibilities in terms of our future, and facticity, seeing who we are in terms of our past. Fallenness is simply being involved in the present, being caught up in our current tasks. And that's something that, of course, we all find ourselves doing. But Heidegger would say, that's okay, that's what it is to be a Dasein. But this raises a very difficult question about the extent to which Heidegger's philosophy is also a kind of ethics. Heidegger says with almost neurotic vehemence that it's nothing of the sort. And he makes fun of people who do ethics and fish in the muddy waters of value. Nevertheless, you can't really approach terms like authenticity and inauthenticity without understanding that what Heidegger is doing here is giving us a kind of desideratum, saying that authenticity is a kind of achievement. And the question is, what is it? Fallenness is, by definition, pre-ontological. It's falling back to the point where we are no longer asking the kinds of questions he urges us to ask. But, of course, authenticity is precisely being ontological, asking those questions, understanding ourselves in a profound way, not simply throwing away our lives in mere curiosity, in idle chit-chat and such, but in an important sense, facing up to who we really are. Facing up to who we really are, becoming authentic, is premised on two other essential structures of Dasein. One is the idea of conscience. And here Heidegger joins a long train of continental philosophers in making the suggestion that we are all in some essential sense guilty. Not guilty of any basic original sin, not guilty of any particular transgression, but just guilty. Conscience, for Heidegger, is not to be construed in terms of the voice of God within us, nor is it to be construed as a Freudian superego, the voice of mom and pop, but rather conscience is that nagging voice inside of us that always reminds us as we're engaged in activities, as we are perhaps a little bit too comfortable in our job, or simply settling back into a marriage, that we can be something more, that there's something missing. That doesn't mean you should quit your job or break up your marriage. But what it means is to become your own self is to reinsert yourself in that job and reinsert yourself in the marriage in an entirely different way. The other existential mode here, in which Heidegger talks about how we are, in a way, prompted into authenticity, goes by the dramatic name being unto death. Now, there's a sense in which, of course, we all know we're going to die. But for most of us, it's an abstraction. For an 18-year-old, they're going to die, but probably not for another 50,000 years. For most of us, who have actually sort of looked into the jaws and survived, we still understand death in a kind of abstract way. We know that all men are mortal. We know that I particularly am immortal, and therefore I will die. But it doesn't really sink in. There's a sense in which it's just abstract. It's just a piece of knowledge. But when you face death, something very interesting happens. When you face death, according to a great many ancient legends, what you find is that your whole life flashes in front of your eyes. Now, this doesn't mean that simply you find yourself watching a biographical video, but rather, you suddenly see your life as a whole. You're suddenly shaken free from your various roles and functions in society to paying attention to just you and the sense in which you are special to yourself. It might be that if you never existed, the world wouldn't miss you. But if you never existed, and there's no way to make this absolutely sensible, if you never existed, the truth is you would miss you. And that's what this forces you to see. What is your life as a whole? That's what it means to be authentic. To be authentic is to use this to make a resolution, namely, to make a resolution to be your own person. But there's a problem here. If inauthenticity is simply falling back into the crowd, doing what you're supposed to do, and so on, and authenticity is this kind of breaking away from the crowd and simply becoming your own person, which might be construed in traditional philosophical terms, as a form of alienation. It is this form of alienation that Heidegger bitterly rejects in modern technological consumer society. His answer is that what we should do is reinsert ourselves in our traditions and our heritage and identify ourselves with what we have grown up with. This provides a kind of justification for his joining the Nazi Party and going along with what his society was doing in the 1930s. What it doesn't justify or explain, however, is why he continued to hold with the Nazi Party, never repented or rejected its atrocities.